All right, guys, so today we are going to talk about CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. So I had this sent to me by the company Levels and I wanted to try it out. I had seen people like Peter Attia talk about it, the importance of continuous glucose monitoring. If you see my podcast with Dr. Ralph Esposito, he talks about it and the utility of it, so you can check out that podcast there. So basically the idea is that you implant this into your arm and it will continuously monitor your glucose, as the name would suggest. There are a lot of issues with rampant glucose levels, right? If you don't produce insulin, you're a type 1 diabetic or a type 2 diabetic, you chronically have high glucose levels. If you are diabetic, there are a lot of potential health issues with that. Right? So some people would argue that even within physiological ranges, it's good to know your glucose levels. There is actually some decent research on this showing that even within a normal range, certain rodent models, and I believe even some human data shows that there are issues or potential worse outcomes compared to people who keep a controlled glucose level. But there is some research, I wouldn't say this is conclusive at all, but that's where some of the research is starting to show. So I figured, hey, why not try it? Let's see if there's anything to it. So as far as putting it in, pretty easy. You really don't feel it. The setup is pretty straightforward. Just goes into your arm. It's there for, I believe, 2 weeks at a time. And it will just really, you can look at your phone and look at it at any given time. So I, as a lot of you know, am very analytical. I love to see the numbers. I keep track of everything. And so to me, it's just interesting experiment to see if there's anything coming from there. Now, again, as far as utility, I'm still on the fence, but we'll get into that a little bit more. So the first night I put it in actually happened to be a very high carb day. I want to call it a cheat day because, again, it wasn't a cheat as far as being off the plan, but it was a planned very high calorie and high carb day, about 1,000 calories of cereal. So, obviously high carb, high sugar. Now, the problem with this is that the first day you put it on, there can be some fluctuations. It can kind of be all over the place. But it was much more, typically you kind of see this biphasic response. Glucose, it will go up, come down a little bit, go up, and then it'll drop. But this was throughout the night very high. Now, I thought that maybe that was just because it was the first time I did it. But upon repeating things like that, repeating very high calorie, I'm talking like 5,000 plus calorie days with a lot of carbs, I continued to see this, very high glucose numbers throughout the night. So that is one thing I learned. I mean, obviously, if it's not surprising that if you were to have 1,000 calories of cereal or a 5,000 calorie day, that your glucose is going to be higher. But I was surprised by how high it got, 160s or so, but continuously throughout the night, even at 3 a.m., I was seeing that. So that did surprise me and makes me think, not that anybody would think that it was healthy necessarily to be eating that many carbs, especially in one go. I think that's probably one of my bigger conclusions from this experiment is that it didn't really show me too much that would change my habits, right? So when I look at it, it's like, well, maybe I shouldn't have 1,000 calories of cereal before going to bed, but that doesn't surprise probably anybody, right? I mean, unless maybe I was really depleted and I had this really intense workout and I was in a growing phase or whatever, maybe there would be situations like that. But I think most of us would probably conclude probably not the best idea if you're looking for longevity. If you're looking for health, that doesn't really change a lot. That kind of dives into some of the other points I had with testing other foods. We know from studies that when you look at a single carb source alone versus that carb source paired with fiber or protein or fat, it's going to be a dramatically different response. And this is something I brought up to Dr. Ralph Esposito during our podcast together, because he had mentioned that I believe it was sweet potatoes that he said he just knew he couldn't have, or apples. But I believe it was quinoa that he said he knew he could have without any issues. And the question I said to him was, have you tried this with other food? And I was surprised that he had not, because to me, very rarely do most of us just eat a sweet potato or just eat a bowl of plain quinoa. So let's say you have a stronger response, a glucose response to sweet potatoes compared to quinoa. Well, if you added 5 ounces of steak, 2 ounces of avocado, maybe something else, to each of those other meals, the sweet potato versus the quinoa, would it similarly still be relatively higher, or would it cancel it out? Because if it would be relatively higher, then maybe you could argue, hey, even though the steak and the avocado brought it down, if it's relatively higher, maybe that's something that could be useful to know. And even that, I think, is debatable, but maybe it's good information. But for all we know, it's going to completely cancel out the effects. I mean, I had numerous meals that were in, the 500 to 1500 calorie range, where it didn't even go, my blood glucose did not even go above 100, which is probably how I should have started this video, is to say what a normal response is. So typically, fasting glucose levels, you want under 100, okay? If you are eating, this is the postprandial period, you want it generally under 130, 140, right? I mean, that's what they consider a normal response to food. And then once you start going into 150, 160, that would be considered problematic. And that's why I mentioned when I had the cereal, I was in the 160 range, but also again, the more problematic issue to me was that it was up and then down, up and down. I mean, really, and I'll show some pictures if I can find them, where it was almost throughout the entire night. But back to the food sources, I do think that that is a really big factor there, because most people are not going to eat these things alone. Now, an apple, sure, some people might just eat fruit alone, but some of these other sources, maybe it's useful to test it, but I still think that you have to consider what else you're going to have with that meal. Two things that I noticed that do not comport with either other people's claims or even some of the literature was, one, when I worked out, I did not notice an increase in my glucose levels. Now, when I've done a ketogenic diet and I've tested my ketones, I've absolutely noticed that my ketones will drop in response to working out. But with the continuous glucose monitoring, I did not notice a large spike in blood glucose or anything really that detectable from my normal workouts. Another thing you'll see claimed, Stan Efferding talks about this a lot, and he's referencing a study where they showed that there was better glucose control from a 10-minute walk after, I think it was just a regular meal, compared to metformin. Now, I wanted to test this out, so I would have some fruit and I would just sit there. I saw my blood glucose go up. Then I would wait hours. I would have the exact same amount of fruit, and then I'd go on a 10 to 15 minute walk. And I actually did not see any difference. In fact, usually it was after the walk that I was slightly higher, not to a level that I think is really significant, but it was just marginally higher. It certainly was not much lower. And so again, intuitively and based on the study, you might think, hey, after you eat, go for a walk. I'm just reporting what I saw on mine, that when I did it, and both times, both ways, I did not see a decrease in glucose levels compared to just sitting there. Now, if I had done it with a much larger meal, maybe there would have been a difference. This was, I think it was like 5 ounces of fruit, waiting a long time, then 5 ounces of fruit. Did not see a difference there. Well, all in all, would I say that this is worth it? I think when you consider that for most people, this is not very accessible, and I believe it can cost a couple $100s per month, I would say that no, I do not think it's worth it. I think if you are diabetic, it can certainly be useful to know your glucose levels at all times. I think if you want to experiment with it, it might be interesting. If you feel like you have problem foods and maybe you feel super lethargic after and you want to try to determine why that is, maybe it could be useful. But I think for most people, most healthy individuals, most of the people watching this, I don't think it's really that useful, because I don't think it's going to really change what you already know. Again, there are some of these studies that do show benefits to keeping your glucose in a well-monitored range, but I don't think the actual choices you're going to make are going to be that different, right? I mean, like I said before, would you be surprised to see that eating a whole pizza or eating, a ton of cereal spikes your glucose? Now, maybe, I'm relatively young, right? I'm a young, active male with a decent amount of muscle mass. So maybe there are going to be some people who have some surprising numbers, right? And I'm not going to say that there's no benefit to it, but when I consider that it's, a couple $100s per month at this point, that it's hard to get a prescription for it, do I think that most people need to be doing this? No. I think if you follow the healthy habits that we've talked about a number of times, I think most people are going to be just fine with that, unless you're just a super curious person like myself and you want to see what results happen when you eat certain foods. I don't think it's a harmful thing to do unless you're somebody who can get really carried away with their neuroticism of all the, the details and going too OCD with it. But, like I said, I'm just somebody who likes to experiment. So that's kind of my recommendation there. Now, I will wrap this up with just kind of a funny story. I think I talked about it maybe on 1 or 2 podcasts. So when I had a ketone meter, it was the Keto Mojo monitor for ketones. And this was probably going a year and a half ago now. And I had decided I was in ketosis for maybe 2 months or so, and I can pull up the numbers. And I had decided to do a keto cheat day. So just to see kind of what the response would be. Now, this was about an 8,000 calorie day of largely fat sources. However, it was also largely these keto foods. So Quest bars technically are keto friendly because of the amount of fiber in them. I was like heavy cream, just very high fat. However, it was also because of all these incidentals, it was something like 300 grams of total carbs. And I think 150 of that was fiber. So you could imagine the amount of bloat and everything on that day. And I'll post my fit day of that day so you can see exactly what the breakdown was. However, something that was kind of amazing is that I still had detectable levels of ketones. Now, something I mentioned this to Dr. Esposito, and he said, if you told me that you were still in ketosis after 300 grams of carbs, I would think you're lying, but hey, those were the numbers. And I had pictures of the monitor showing it. It had been accurate and tested with other monitors previously. But again, you have to consider the huge amount of fat that I had and the huge amount of fiber, not to mention that if I had done this for even one more day, I probably would have been kicked out of ketosis, right? Even high levels of protein can kick you out of ketosis. But it was very interesting to see that just from one day, super high fat and high fiber, I was still able to stay in ketosis. And I'm talking like a low level of nutritional ketosis, like 0.7 millimoles. Okay, so nothing like what people see in the 3 to 5 millimole range, but it was interesting nevertheless. Again, not something I would typically recommend, but I do like to experiment and kind of see these numbers. And my glucose levels, obviously, there tends to be an inverse relationship there. My glucose levels did not get super high either. So just a little bit of story time there, guys. If you want to hear more about the keto bulk, the keto cheat day, or anything with the continuous glucose monitor, post a comment, let me know. You can also DM me on Instagram, Dave_McConey. If you like the video, subscribe for more, and I will see you guys next time.